Corinthian spirit. Don't tell me what to do. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands or to have connected them to another. That is to say, the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence says, we got to tell you why we're no longer listening to your authority. That is an incredibly scary moment, epistemologically. Well, like, what's the right thing to do? Jefferson will say, it's our right, it's our duty. Well, in other words, we have no choice. He starts to sound almost absolutist in terms of his epistemological persuasions about what has to happen. The way they finish that document is to say, we're ready to die for this cause. That sounds pretty absolutist. And yet standing behind that absolutist position is the fallibilist question. What is government supposed to be all about? Very romantic question. And epistemologically, there we are. In terms of ontology and who we are, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment began to open up the box of the question of who are you? Now, of course, this is an ancient question. I mean, Plato was asking the same question long ago. The difference is that by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, we begin to ask this question in more detailed and, I would say, intentional ways. In other words, we'll begin to see the for you, as we'll sometimes call it in 303, the for you. That is to say, if you'll think about it, there is a you that is inside. There is a you that is outside. There is a you that is singular. There is a you that's plural. I mean, think about the power of an idea like this. There is a you that is singular and outside. In other words, there's you, your body. We can, of course, measure that, and that's a big, write that down, that's huge, because that's the scientific method. We're going to begin to measure, we're going to begin to calculate, we're going to begin to define who you are physiologically. I mean, yeah, you are a brain, no doubt, and you're all this other stuff that you are. And we can begin to ask important questions about you in terms of your body. But surely you are not just your body, you have this other thing that is individual, but is interior. Namely, of course, what do you want to call it? Mind, consciousness? I mean, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but it does beg the question, what is that? What is that that's aware that you have a body? Your mind? I mean, you have to have a mind to argue against the notion of mind. You have to have consciousness to argue against the very idea of consciousness, and yet where is it? Produce it so we can weigh your consciousness. Well, no, that's not the way it works at all. So you're saying it doesn't exist. No, it definitely exists. It's just a different understanding of who you are. But that's not just who you are. Think about it. There's also a plurality of you. I mean, Plato was the one that pointed this out in Republic. Long before you were born, you were born. You carry your DNA of your great-great-great-grandma in you. We know that. But there's all the other stuff. I mean, think about this. There's a cultural phenomenon, right? I am my own person, I'll go my own way. Funny, you said it in a language you never chose to learn. A language you didn't invent. And yeah, there you are. In other words, we're a product. Tennyson will say it this way in his famous poem Ulysses. I'm a part of all that I have met. You're a product of everything that came before you. Culturally? Historically? So we have to ask questions about all that stuff. I mean, we don't just live anymore in some kind of vacuum by 1800. We're acutely aware of the rest of the world. People are coming back from all over the world saying, whoa, 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 they do some weird stuff where I just came from. And everybody starts sharing these ideas. We're going to get writers, for example, who are very influenced by the thoughts of what then was called the Orientals. Just another word for the foreign. And it was foreign to the English because it came from further east, way further east. Can we say it? China. Very strange. But they produced stuff in philosophies. I mean, we're going to take a look at some of these titles. And Blake, William Blake, the great Romantic writer, I mean, he's very influenced by Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. Very influenced by the teachings of Buddha. And he's going to play games with some of these ideas, and they will influence the way that he understands the world around him. So clearly, we're a product of the culture. But that's interior. The way you adopt cultural views in your own life, that's interior, that's single. But what about What about the exterior? What about things like systems? What about things like money? What about stuff like that? I mean, the ways in which money affects the way you get to live your life. Right? And some people will call, of course, having a lot privilege. Other people will call it blessing. I mean, it all depends on the language, right? The spiritual religious language is, oh, you're very blessed. The economic language is, oh, you're very privileged. And of course, there's this tension that starts to happen, like a simple question, like this one. How come you guys get to have so much and other people don't who are the same age as you? How come you got to grow up with a, with a refrigerator with food and other people didn't? Like, why? Where is the fairness in that paradigm? And how come you get to have something other people don't get to have? These questions become legit questions after the scientific revolution. Of course, part of that was a simple question. Can we grow enough food for everybody on the planet? In 1800, they actually started asking questions like that. Or this one. Can we take care of our environment? The environmentalist movement begins in roughly 1800. Of course, that makes sense, because all of a sudden you can measure the globe. And you can actually take a look at the amount of food source on the planet. You can begin to do games like that. You can look, for example, at what's going on environmentally. And if we destroy our environment, what does that mean for generations to come? Obviously, it's become a talking point of your generation. What does it mean to talk about issues like global warming and all the other kinds of climate change that's occurring on the planet? Is it true? Is it not true? We're back to epistemology. All of this is a part of who you are. You're a very complicated person with at least 4 yous. A physiological, biological you, a cognitive, psychological you, a conscious you, a cultural you, and then of course a product of some kind of systems that have created who you are. And you're all of those things. By 1800 we start to ask questions about ontologically, can we study all that? Can we measure all of that? Of course, in our big five, from ontology we move to psychology, sociology, 2 sides of the dynamic. I mean, you're not here unless 2 people hook up and exchange fluids to produce you. That is to say, before you're a psychology, you're a sociology. Do you get me? In other words, before you ever call yourself you, there have to be 2 other people who decide to produce you. So there is an interesting tension between, on the one hand, you and your psychological motivations, and the rest of us. Who gets to decide how you should behave? That is a very interesting question. Should you have total rights to do whatever you want as an individual, or are you rather a part of this larger matrix that we'll call sociological dimension? And therefore, the group takes precedence over you. You may not want to do it, but everybody else needs to do it. Right? And as I even give this lecture, I mean, we're sitting in a room with cloth on our face. Obviously, this is part of the debate. Should I be able to do what I want versus what other people tell me I have to do? The tension between psychology and sociology is born in large measure not during this time of 1800. It's begun to be studied during this time. Now that's the key. It's not that all this was brand new. It's that we started to give serious credence to the idea of studying it. How can we measure psychological motivations? Very interesting. Like, for example, why is it some students work really, really hard to get grades, and other students are like, grades schmades, it doesn't matter anyway. Why is that? Why is it that some are so motivated? Well, I don't know, but that sounds a whole lot like Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. Right? I mean, go to the end of that to be or not to be speech again, and there it is, right? Reset it. There's thinkers and there's doers. Why is that tension there? Or that is to say, to be or not to be is the tension between the psychological and the sociological. Of course, this idea that there are powerful motivations which promote our actions will come to its, really fruition in Sigmund Freud by 1900 in his publishing of The Interpretation of Dreams. And Freud will have tremendous influence. It'll be Freud that will say, while Darwin is right that there is struggle biologically, and Marx is right, there is struggle economically, there is a struggle that we will call psychic struggle. And he will say that your mind is constantly playing the game of thinking along multiple strands. For example, he says we're constantly thinking about sex. Not so much because of pleasure. Freud will say we rarely seem to have much pleasure with sex. It's far more about continuation of the species. Because if we don't have children, then the human species dies, and we're back to our Darwin. But we're always thinking about this notion of sexuality and what is appropriate or inappropriate sexuality. But that's not all. We're also constantly thinking about rage. All of us, Freud says, walk around wishing we had a bat. We could just walk up to somebody we don't like and smash them with it. We are acculturated, educated, to act otherwise. But we sublimate those feelings and, oh baby, they're there. You don't believe me, watch somebody say one mean, nasty thing to you or about you online. Oh no, she didn't. And then all of a sudden, bam, now we're off, we're ready to fight. Where does that come from? How can you be so calm and then all of a sudden somebody can say one thing to you and you're... Freud says it's there. It's right beneath the surface. We'll come back to that word picture in a second, beneath the surface. But there's a third one, a voice in your head that's constantly at play. And this one is the anxiety, the angst, the worry, the walling hands, for those of you that know that show. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And that's why we have this tendency to want to put things in our mouth and gnaw on by worry and worry and worry. Because we're constantly worrying. Of course, our penultimate worry, we learned this already with our study of Beowulf, right? Our penultimate worry is death. You ain't met no 200-year-old people, which means you don't get to swing it to park for very long. That van is waiting, and we know that it's waiting. We learn that at a very young age. Whoa, wait, what are you telling me? You mean I'm not going to be here in 200 years? No, you will not. Well, then where will I be? That is a very interesting question, but it ain't going to be here. Whoa, wait, like, what do I do? Like, well, Freud says we're constantly thinking about that. Wait. Some of you go, I'm not thinking about any of those things. Wait. Freud says most of what you think is unconscious. Not conscious. Unconscious. And he provides this word picture. It's a fascinating word picture. He says, your mind is like that disgusting river you drive over to get out of this town. The Bighorn River. Right? I mean, think about that river. There is the surface of that river. You can go, I mean, we can jump in a bus and drive over there real quick. And we can see it, right? We're looking at it. There's the surface. That ain't the river. That's only part of the river. Down below that surface, oh, there's a whole lot of river. Are you familiar with these guys? They like go back and reach their arm back in under the banks of these rivers and they let these huge fish bite on them and they pull them out. Fish that are the size of the table you're sitting at. It's kind of horrifying. Wait, those things live. Yeah, they do. Of course, think about this. We could stop the water of the Bighorn River and we could go down still and there's more river. There's more river. That's that mud. And that sediment, right? I mean, wouldn't that be fascinating, right? Especially right below that bridge, to see all the stuff over the years that have been thrown. If you could go 20 feet down into that mud, that'd be fascinating to see what you could find. We know you'd find some really interesting artifacts. Agreed? Freud said that's an interesting picture of your mind. You have all these multiple layers that are, the river continues to flow. You only see a small part of the river. Everything else is down underneath, right? And Freud says that's the perfect exemplar of what it means to be a thinking, motivated person. A psyche, we might say. Well, of course, if you can play that game, then you can start to talk about psychological pathologies and the ways in which those pathologies can be fixed. And so much of this is going to be influenced in our writers. So, for example, you're standing there getting ready to go out for prom. There are 3 people in front of you. You're standing in the hall. Mr. Durt's reading the names out. One in front, then the next one. Now you step up. You're getting ready to go. You're just hoping as you walk down that path you don't fall in, face plant, and just embarrass yourself. That's the external representation of what's going on. What if we were to ask what's going on in your mind? Because Freud suggests that during the time I've been talking about Freud, if we hit the print key on everything you thought, the paper would fill this room. That's what he says. That's how much thinking has been going on. So what if you were to represent just the thoughts while you're standing there? 2 in front go, next one goes, now it's your turn to go. Not describing it from the perspective of the physical, but just simply the psychological. James Joyce in 1922 will write his famous novel Ulysses about one man in one day, and the book is 800 pages long. All he does is describe thoughts. The stream of consciousness. It's all born during this time of the Romantic period, okay? Now, sociologically, of course, let's put it in our notes. Obviously, there's a tension, right? That is to say, the individual versus society. And this is where, of course, we're going to pick up writers like Darwin and Marx, who are going to make this argument about what does it mean for there to be economic fairness? Or what is this thing about economic tension? All of that born during this time of the Romantics as well. And Wordsworth, the great British Romantic writer, will say it this way: the world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We've given our hearts away, a sordid bit. In other words, science gives rise to technology, which gives rise to the goal of the currency. But what happens is we start to care too much about the money. We start to care too much about the stuff. Tracy Chapman calls it mountains and mountains of stuff. And all of a sudden, we've given our hearts away. We're not authentic anymore. We're not real anymore. We're somehow lesser because of that. So there's this tension, on the one hand, of being an individual, psychology, and fitting into the group, sociology. And why is it the case that when you were in 7th grade, you were really freaked out about going into the lunchroom if you had done something different to your hair or to your clothes? But by the time you're a senior, you seem to care less about that. Because all of a sudden you're like, you know what, I really don't care what people think about the way I dress or the way I look. I'm going to be who I'm going to be. How did you make that transition? How did that work? So that sociologically there's such power when we're younger, and then as we get older we start to become, you know, can we say it? Promethean. More rebellious about it. You can't tell me what to do. You don't get to define who I am and put all these strictures on me. It's fascinating. Like, how does that movement happen? We start to ask that question during the time, the age of the Romantics. Finally, of course, our last of the big five is the question of theodicy. Why do such terrible things happen? And is there a way to keep them from happening? And we'll have the rise of the utopians, right? That is to say, Marx falls into this category. We can make the world a perfect place. Well, Milton taught us about this already. Here's the problem with perfection. Boring. We find right away. When we get perfect, we start to get bored. So we blow it up. That's one reading of Paradise Lost. It is an interesting reading of Paradise Lost. We seem to want not utopia. And yet, we long for things to be better. Isn't that the whole point of science? To make things better. How do we know what's better before history plays out? How do we know? It's a constant question. Ultimately, the question of suffering in the world is the oldest question on the planet. It remains the question, and of course the Romantics are going to play that game as well. They will begin to identify. We'll see this in our study of Wordsworth and Tintern Abbey. They will begin to argue that you have to learn to ask, why did this happen for me when bad things happen, as opposed to why did this happen to me? To see yourself as nothing more than a victim in a universe where all this terrible stuff happens and you have no power, that's a bad way to live your life. So we have this tension. Let's finish now our comments. We have this tension that's happening on both sides of the pond that we call the Atlantic. This is fascinating. We will have in England 2 generations of Romantic thinkers in literature. Generation 1, Generation 2, or the old farts, as many of us will call them, and the young gun hellions, the younger kids. Let's go through them really quickly, because this is the order in which we'll study them together. First of all, the Generation 1 poets. We'll begin with Burns, the great Scottish poet. We'll go then to Blake, and from Blake we'll go to Wordsworth, who I've mentioned a number of times in this lecture, and culminate with Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, one of the most important texts that will deal with our big five. Then we'll have a second generation of Romantic thinkers. Byron, Shelley, Keats. We'll finish with Keats. And when we're there, we will recognize that all that has come before is somehow subsumed in that amazing voice. Of course, Keats will say, nobody does it as well as Shakespeare and Milton. Some today say Keats might have come close. But notice on the other side of the pond, at the same time, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and sometimes not put in that list that has to be put in that list as a powerful transcendentalist and Romantic voice, of course, Frederick Douglass, the emancipated slave. I mean, who better to talk about America and American history than an emancipated slave who couldn't read and then learned how to read and then read the Declaration of Independence. And in the moment of reading the Declaration of Independence, tears flow from his eyes. This is your founding document of your country? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal? Can you please explain that to me? Beautiful. It is that challenge. Of course, this is a time of revolutions. We have to put that in our notes. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. All of these revolutions, of course, are going to change the way people think and feel, the very air that they will breathe. Finally, this movement into the 20th century and, of course, beyond will be that tension that will give rise from modernity to post-modernity. We will move from the differentiation of the value spheres to the complete disassociation of the value spheres. And there's a whole lot lost in a moment like that. Because science, the quest for new knowledge through the fallibilist epistemological position, can easily become scientism. And it can become as absolutist as any other dogmatism. And in the moment when that happens, it seems as if we're back to the Dark Ages all over again. Where if you don't agree, then you're toast on a post or soap on a rope. Wait, how is that possible? How is it possible that we could go back to such dogmatic, absolutist epistemological positions? Well, see, this is that tension that will be born of this time. Finally, we will see in that tension the two great voices of the 20th century. I've already mentioned Joyce in the fiction domain, but in the poetry domain, we're going to meet W.B. Yeats and the great